Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to Stately Von Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about something very exciting. We're going to be talking about Pulps, the hero of Pulps, the hero of Pulps. So, next month is the greatest reading event ever created on BookTube, which would be Garbaugust, which has made me think even more about something I'm doing called the Pulp Hero Project. Because this stuff, I mean, it's really kind of the roots of Garbaugust. Garbaugust celebrates trashy fiction, or what is considered to be trashy fiction by society. And certainly that can be said about the pulps, the old school pulps from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. That was certainly considered trashy fiction at the time. These old, sensational, popular fiction magazines, printed on cheap pulp paper, full of action and adventure and thrills. It was the most accessible form of entertainment for a lot of people who were not rich. People, of low income, of which there were many in the 1930s during the Depression. The pulps were everywhere and they were very widely read. And they were full of anything you wanted to read about. There were pulps about everything. There were pulps about sports. There were boxing pulps. There was football pulps. There were pulps about airplanes. There were pulps about war. There were pulps about detectives and cowboys. Western pulps. I mean, everything. Every kind of genre that you were interested in, you probably could find a pulp magazine full of thrilling stories that were pounded out quite quickly, usually, not with usually any high artistic aspirations, but just as pure entertainment. And within the pulps, there was a brief phenomena which lasted about 20 years, give or take. And that was the phenomena of the hero pulps, which have proven to be very influential because they were highly influential on superheroes, which have become huge in our modern culture, of course, mostly due to the films, but also because of the comic books. The superheroes certainly wouldn't be what they were or what they are if it had not been for the pulps, for these hero pulps and these characters that I'll be talking about. And so what I'm going to be doing is one of the things I'm doing anyway, is reading a bunch of these hero pulps, focusing mostly on the two big guns of the hero pulps. So the hero pulps started in 1931 with this character. This is the Shadow. The Shadow, who nowadays, most people, if they remember him at all, either remember him from the 1990s movie. There was a movie, I think it was 94, I don't remember. Or from the old time radio show. The pulp character isn't read that often anymore, although some diehard pulp fans and adventure fans still find old reprints of The Shadow and read them, because what a great character. So The Shadow showed up in 1931 in kind of a weird way. There was a radio program that was sponsored by a magazine, Street and Smith, sponsored this radio program. And this radio program had a host called the Shadow, he was like the host, and he would tell you, introduce creepy stories. And he became quite popular, this radio show host. This was before the Shadow had his own radio show. And so they came up with the idea, Street and Smith did, well, what if we did a whole mystery magazine just about a character called the Shadow? And they gave that basic idea, which was basically nothing. It was just, a creepy character called the Shadow. And gave this idea to Walter Gibson, who was a journalist and magician. And Walter Gibson invented everything we know basically about the Shadow. The Shadow, who was very, very mysterious, particularly when he first showed up. You didn't know who he was. You just know that he fought crime. He had agents that worked for him. Most of these agents didn't know anything more about the Shadow than you did. His secret identity at the time was completely unknown. Later on, it looked like Lamont Cranston, the playboy Lamont Cranston, was the Shadow. But it turned out, not really. Lamont Cranston was a real guy, but the Shadow sometimes used his identity and disguised himself as Lamont Cranston. He was actually, we eventually found out that the Shadow was actually a guy named Kent Allard, who was a World War I fighter pilot, if I'm remembering correctly. But was even that true? Even about that origin, we could never really be sure, because this character was just so darn mysterious. He was also a dark avenger. I mean, he was, he would take you out. The Shadow didn't have the powers that the radio show Shadow had, where the radio show Shadow could turn himself invisible by clouding your mind. This Shadow couldn't do that. He would hide in the darkness using his dark clothing. But, if you turned on the lights, there he'd be, and he'd probably kill you if you were a criminal, because he did a lot of that. He was tremendously popular, and it was the Shadow that started the boom, the relatively short-lived boom of pulp heroes. Like I said, it lasted around 20 years before it fizzled out. And these adventures of the Shadow were just so great. And he was a major influence on Batman. The first issue of Batman, the first Batman story in Detective Comics, basically ripped off the plot of a Shadow novel. This one, I think, Partners in Peril, which is why I grabbed this issue. Partners in Peril was the novel, I believe, that was stolen for the first Batman adventure, which nobody thought much of, to steal stuff from the pulps, because this was all disposable entertainment. Nobody knew anybody would care, about the characters or their stuff, And the comic books outright stole a lot of plots and ideas and just things from the pulps. And yeah, definitely the Shadow was a character that everybody took inspiration from and stole from, basically. Very, very popular character. So popular, in fact, that Street and Smith decided, you know what? We need another character, but it can't be like the Shadow. So they invented Doc Savage. Doc Savage was a really interesting character. He practically had superpowers. So Doc Savage, who was trained since he was a little kid to be a virtual Superman by his father, eventually became a virtual Superman. He had his own agents. He had a team that worked with him. And basically, his team and Doc Savage, they just went out and had incredible adventures that were just so wild and entertaining. And it lasted throughout pretty much the whole of the hero boom Doc Savage did. this is how Doc Savage was depicted on the pulp covers. Inside these early issues, though, he was a bit different. Inside the issues, that's Doc Savage. Now, this is not how we normally consider Doc Savage to have looked. He looks suspiciously like a certain movie star that was famous at the time, but you know, who knows? And right here, it has, in all this world, there is no other man like Doc Savage. No one who can compare with him in ability, in strength, in color, and in the ideals which are his existence. Nothing is too difficult for him to attempt. No one is too insignificant to have his aid. A great success, Doc Savage, as a pulp character. Didn't have so much success outside of the pulps. Unlike the Shadow, there was never... He never made any films at the time. Like the Shadow, there were some serials. Doc Savage, while the magazine was being published, never made any serials. He did have a radio show, but only a few of them, and no transcripts or recordings survive, unfortunately, of the radio show for Doc Savage. That would be really cool if we had that. But very popular as a pulp character. Now, what happened with the hero pulps is that they went through a very successful time during the 1930s and the early 1940s. But things changed during and after World War II. The sensational aspects of the pulps, the wildness, the stuff we love about them now, became a little less favored. And a lot of the pulps sort of toned it down. Doc Savage did change in his later adventures. He became, well, a little bit more human and a little bit more vulnerable, which is not something you really normally think of when you think of Doc Savage. But towards the end of this 20-year run, most of the characters either got watered down or changed. Doc Savage actually did fairly well in that he mostly remained himself, even if his band of helpers sort of diminished to a couple, The later Docs were a bit different from the earlier ones. These were written mostly by Lester Dent, who was a very entertaining pulp writer and had a very adventurous life on his own. He was a fascinating character. I keep promising to make a video about Dent, and I haven't yet. I really ought to do that. Another character, which was a lot of fun, and probably one of the most extreme of the pulp characters, was the Spider. The Spider was created to be direct competition to the Shadow, as you can tell from this wonderful Steranko cover for this paperback. The Shadow and the Spider, though, were very different in a lot of ways. The Spider, he also had the slouch hat and the cape and the dark clothing, but he also had a big wig and makeup to make him look extra creepy, and he had these big fangs. He just was a creepy looking character. So creepy, in fact, that they didn't put him on the covers of the magazines as himself. He was usually depicted looking a lot like this fella here. He looked a lot like Steranko's version of the Spider. Because some things are just, too horrible to see, I guess. There were a few covers where the Spider looked like he did in the magazine, but usually you got a very sanitized version of this character. And this character was wild, man. The Shadow was very mysterious and struck you as being very cold and emotionless when he went about his business. Not so the Spider. The Spider was all drama, all human drama. And the things the spider had to go through in his adventures. I mean, it's amazing he could still even move at all. He was injured very frequently. He was shot, he was beaten, he was stabbed, he was hung upside down by his feet, he was knocked out all the time. Terrible things tended to happen to the spider, as terrible things tended to happen to the city, New York, where he lived and worked in. I mean, the subway was blown up multiple times. Various buildings in the city were blown up. The villains that he went up against were hardcore. You know, the spider's city was always under siege, and you never really knew what was going to happen. It was a bizarre pulp fantasy land where any catastrophe could happen, including New York being taken over by fascists. So the spider had to conquer the fascists who took over New York. It was a wild time, and this was a wild character, and a tremendous amount of fun. Again, towards the end of this initial run of the pulp heroes, this character got watered down quite a bit towards the end. Most of them did, and then just kind of disappeared like most of these characters did. But the spider, he was one of the biggies from this era. And then I've got some other kind of random characters that I'm going to be looking at. One is the Black Bat. The Black Bat didn't have his own magazine. He was in the Black Book Detective magazine. And so the Black Bat was one of the lesser known pulp heroes. We still remember the Black Bat. Very often we remember him, though, because he looks vaguely like Batman. He's got the cowl and he's got a cape that looks a lot like Batman's cape, which has led to suspicions that one ripped off the other. It actually looks like that didn't happen. The first Black Bat story was written before the first Batman story was published, but it wasn't published until after the first Batman story was published. So it looks like these two characters just kind of showed up on the scene, and that their appearance was a coincidence. The Black Bat was a classic pulp hero. He had his guns, but he also had kind of mild superpowers. The Black Bat could see at night. And he also, could smell and hear better than the average person. And he used these spellbinding powers to fight crime. I mean, as superpowers go, they weren't much. But, any edge you can get when you're fighting crime, I guess, is a good one. And these were fun. And so I'm going to have a good time with that. The Green Llama is just kind of weird. I've never actually read a Green Llama story. This was a series that was published in Double Detective magazine. Again, the Green Llama was kind of a character that was inspired by the Shadow. This one, though, was a guy who became a Buddhist in Tibet and used his Buddhist skills, I guess, to fight crime. Any skills you can have, I guess, will help you fight crime. This is not a character I've read much about. This is not a character I've read at all. So this will be fun. This will be fun to check out the Green Llama. And of course, we can't do this without Zorro. Zorro, the Western hero Zorro from California. Originally, this was not intended to be a pulp hero, but a serialized pulp hero or recurring pulp hero. But he became one. If I'm remembering correctly, in his first story, at the end of the story, and tell me if I'm wrong, but from what I remember, I think he gave up his secret identity at the end of the story. He's like, yeah, I'm Zorro. But then he was so popular, he had to come back. And then everybody just kind of conveniently forgot that he was who Zorro was. So, if I'm remembering correctly, it went something like that. But I love Zorro. I even have a dog named Zorro. So, gotta have Zorro. So he's part of my pulp fiction project as well. And I'm planning on reading a lot of these. I have to because I've got so many. Mostly I have a lot of Doc Savage and the Shadow. They're the characters I have the most of. Although I've got a ton of the Spider. I've got a few bigger collections like that, and I've got some individual spiders, but most of the individual spiders I have are on Kindle. So I'll be reading a lot of the Spider's adventures on Kindle. Other characters I don't know that are even available on Kindle. I'm not even sure you can get the Black Bat on Kindle at all. I'll have to check. The Shadow you can't. Doc Savage you can. So, it just depends who has the rights and who wants to put them up as ebooks. But it's going to be a lot of fun. These are characters that are just so cool and so fun. And I'm even going to be including a character who isn't really technically a pulp hero, but I always think of him kind of in that way, even though he is an occult investigator, the greatest occult investigator, Jules de Grandin. Jules de Grandin by Seabury Quinn, which was published in Weird Tales. His adventures started in the mid-20s, before the Shadow ever showed up on the scene, and continued into the early 50s. So this was a character that was published for a long time, Jules de Grandin, who just fought every kind of supernatural menace you can think of, and probably a bunch you couldn't think of. So, yeah, Jules de Grandin, a fabulous character that I'm going to be reading again very soon as part of this whole thing. And I will be reporting to you during my weekend reading reports about all the fun and the action. I guess that's all I have to say for today. But yeah, Pulp Adventures and the roots of Garbaugust. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.